finally, we're in 2017 now. Finally, all of the European economies are actually growing. They're not growing much, but they're growing a little. The IMF actually feels a little bit better about the trajectory of the global economy now than they have over the course of years since the global recession. But the geopolitics don't feel good at all. And, you know, there are, I would say, three big reasons for that. We talk about the G0 world, this geopolitical recession where the U.S.-led order is unwinding. But, you know, all the headlines that we see and all of the concerns about, you know, is it the North Koreans, or is it the Iranians, or is it the Russians, or who's coming after us next? I'd put it in three different baskets.
Okay.
The first is Rocket Man. And
you like that term, don't you?
I love that term. I love that term. I love the song, and I like the term. But Rocket Man, for me, represents the fact that if the United States is not able to drive the global order, if we're not seen by our allies as the global policeman, if we don't want to be the architect of global trade, if we don't want to drive global values, then that means our allies are going to hedge away from us. It means that our antagonists are going to be able to act with more impunity in their own backyards and more broadly. And it means that rogue states like the Iranians, the Syrians, Assad's not going anywhere, the North Koreans are going to be able to do a lot more. And so that's one reason why we see a lot more Rocket Man in this environment. Second big point, AfD. Just we're talking about the headlines this week. AfD is the Alternatives for Deutschland Party. And that is the group, this strongly Eurosceptic nationalist party that not only has gotten into the Bundestag after German elections this last weekend, but they got 13% of the vote. This is the first time a strongly nationalist party has been in the German Bundestag since World War II. So, I mean, it's really quite something. And it doesn't mean that Merkel can't run Germany anymore. She is still going to be chancellor for the fourth time in a row. She's clearly the strongest voice in the European environment and probably the strongest pro-democratic voice in the world today. But in the United States and in Europe and in other countries too, we're seeing so many people saying, I don't trust my leaders. And not only do I not trust my political leaders, but I don't trust my corporate leaders, I don't trust my banking leaders, I don't trust my media, I don't trust my public intellectuals, my talking heads, whatever it is. And so I'm going to protest. And protest may mean sit out and not vote. Protest may mean revolt. But when you're voting, protest usually means vote against the bums, whoever they are. And clearly, we saw that with the Brexit vote. Clearly, we saw that in the United States with Trump and Sanders. Clearly, we saw that in France. Yes, Macron won, but the established political parties in France got destroyed. The far-right National Front did better than the center-right. The communists did better than the Social Democrats. Macron only won because he created a completely new party. He started with 60% support. He's now down to 40 and saying, I want more Europe isn't going so well. And now in Germany, even though that's the country where the economy seems to be doing the best for the middle class and the working class, and where they're not as worried that Europe is going to suddenly fall apart. There's not like this sense of we want to leave Europe, because of course Europe has done quite well for the German economy.
Yep.
But a lot of Germans, particularly those living in former East Germany, now there's reunification, and they look around and they say, wow, it's just kind of like Americans in Appalachia. What's the dream for us? And so they're voting to throw all the bums out. And so I think that's a much bigger thing. Final thing, I said there were three. You've got this top-down, U.S. isn't leading the way it used to, global unwind. You have this bottom-up, people don't like their leaders, throw the bums out, much more extremism, populism. And then you have China. And, you know, there was an assumption that as China got more powerful, as they got bigger, as they moved towards a consumer-led economy, they were going to need to reform politically. That's really not true. China's getting much more powerful. Their economy is now 60% as big as the United States. They'll soon be larger than the United States. They already have more influence economically than the Americans do, because when the Chinese write a check, it's the government and the companies together, as opposed to the Americans, the government and the corporations very separate. But they don't need to politically reform. And they don't, in part, because the control of technology in China has given them much more stability in terms of how people do and don't interact in a way that the Americans, that's really done by the companies, by Facebook and Amazon. And also because in America, globalization takes jobs away. Corporations say, no, we want to maximize profit. In China, it's not about maximizing profit. In China, you can be inefficient and create a lot of jobs for people if that's what helps political and social stability. So at least for the next 10 years, the country that's going to be doing the most in affecting the global economic and political landscape is also a country that has a model which is very different from our own in the United States and those of the liberal democracies, and it's not going to be undermined. It's not going to integrate towards the U.S. In fact, in many ways, it's the other way around.
What about if I just go, to global trade? Where do you see it going? When you've got NAFTA, U.S.-China, TPC, end of trade deals under Trump. Where are we headed to in the next 2 to 5 years?
We are headed away from a U.S.-led global free market towards a much more fragmented hybrid economy. The U.S. dollar remains the world's reserve currency. Nothing challenges it. The euro will certainly not be that. The sterling will certainly not be that. The RMB will only be doing local denominated deals, but it won't be globally convertible. But the idea that multinationals are looking at an increasingly tight and global free market, that's just not the case. You're going to see a lot more tariffs, a lot more protectionism, and you're going to see a lot more rules set on what sectors you can and can't invest in terms of foreign direct investment for national security purposes. And most importantly, the military-industrial complex will increasingly become a military-industrial technological complex, and all of the most important firms about technology will be seen as critical for governments to be stable. So in other words, if you trade in big data, if you're developing AI, if you're doing advanced robotics, if you're doing surveillance, in other words, if you're doing all the things that are making some of the world's largest companies in value and profitability today, you're increasingly strategic to governments. And that means that you're the antithesis of a free market. Coca-Cola has a free market, right? If you're Coke, you sell everywhere. Raytheon doesn't, right? Because they're selling military goods to America and its allies. Increasingly, technology companies are going to look more like military companies in the way the global markets appear and how they have to navigate them, and less like consumer goods companies. Even a company like Apple, I think that'll be true. Face recognition, all that data, you can't think of that as, I'm just selling to consumers. It's not going to work.
One of the things has been, continues to be in the paper every week. There seems to be a new hack. Cyber continues to be on the forefront of things. How is that going to affect, how we interact from a business perspective with the rest of the world?
We didn't talk much about North Korea. To the extent that I'm worried about Kim Jong-un, it's not that he's going to launch a weapon against the United States, a nuke against San Francisco. That would be the end of North Korea. What worries me is his cyber capabilities continue to grow, and he's using them. I mean, you remember when he hit Sony Pictures and made all of their files public? Then the North Koreans hit the Central Bank of Bangladesh. They almost stole $1 billion with their SWIFT codes. It was a human error that foiled that, their own human error. They ended up getting less than 100 million.
Still 100 million.
Well, I mean, that's a lot from North Korea, I'll tell you that. And then you saw the WannaCry virus, which hit the Chinese more than it hit the Americans. That was North Korean. I think the fact that the North Koreans on cyber look like a criminal syndicate that's basically integrated with the state, and the Americans don't know how to respond to it, that's a real issue. The fact that the Russian government hacked the American elections with impunity, I don't believe there was collusion with Trump. I'm not even sure they were trying to get Trump to win. I think they were trying to delegitimize the American election and make us look weaker in the eyes of our own people. But the Americans did not know how to respond to that, right? It's like, what do? We put out information on Putin? Russia doesn't care. That's not tit for tat, but we're not going to attack them. We're not going to like suddenly send a missile. So what do? Do we start using cyber to break some of their infrastructure? You could have done that, but then they could have done that to us. America is the sole superpower in the world, but on cyber, that's increasingly not true. The Russians are almost at parity with the United States on cyber. And we also have, at least one arm tied behind our back on cyber because we're much more reluctant to use it. And there's also a lot more transparency into who's doing what to whom around American actors like Snowden. You know, when we find out like half of what the NSA's practices are globally end up being known publicly, the Germans get upset with the Americans, the Brazilians get upset, we have to change our activity. There's no Snowden in China, there's no Snowden in Russia, right? So, well, there is a Snowden in Russia, but he's an American Snowden in Russia. So I do think that cyber is one of these things that is making it harder for Western governments to govern. Because, you know, if you and I, we give authority to government, and we do that because that government protects us. They provide us with security and with the sense of like we can have opportunities in this country. Now, if going forward, if all of our personal information, like with Equifax, for example, or Yahoo, is made public and the government can do nothing to regulate or ensure that that's not the case, or if a country attacks us with cyber and our government is saying, not our problem, they attack Sony Pictures and then the government tells Sony Pictures, well, if you want to take reverse sort of measures, go for it. That undermines the importance of that government in our own eyes, the eyes of the citizens. And so I do think that cyber is one of these things that is actually weakening Western governance and is going to make it harder for these countries that uphold free market standards to continue to do so going forward.
You know, Ian, we've come to the end of this session. Can you leave us with one or two thoughts that you think business leaders ought to be thinking about in the boardroom?
I guess I would say that this is an environment where understanding what governments want and their ability to implement those things is changing radically. And it's changing radically in a way that it will affect your bottom line. Historically, there are so many companies in the world that could say, look, as long as I have the right product for my consumers and I can get to them and my brand is good, that's all that really matters. I think that that is really changing. And so the nature of government relations and how strategic that is for a CEO and for a board really matters to them. And I would also say that to the extent that governments are getting weaker and are seen as less legitimate, companies are going to be required to be more patriotic. And they're going to be required to do more for citizens as opposed to just for shareholders. So, I mean, in other words, I don't think it's enough to just say how you are making an enormous amount of money and our returns are wonderful. I think increasingly CEOs are going to be required to say, well, wait a second, you just closed that company, you just closed that plant, or you just did that corporate inversion because your taxes are lower. How are you an American corporation? Why would we support you? I think CEOs are going to have a good answer for that feels authentic. It doesn't feel like our sustainability platform or what we're doing to sort of improve gender. It can't just be ticking the box exercise. I think the CEOs that get that right and that are ahead of their competitors will really benefit. They'll reap the benefits for doing that.
Well, Ian, it's been a pleasure having you on here today. I look forward to having you back. But I'm also looking forward to seeing you in live again at our 2018 Board Leadership Conference in San Diego. So I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much.